So much has happened, and there's so much that's gone past. Your ex-husband, Eddie Van Halen, passed away.
October 2020 arrived quietly for most people, but for Valerie Bertinelli, it carried the kind of weight that doesn't announce itself. It just lands. Eddie Van Halen was gone, and she was standing at the edge of a grief that refused to fit into any category she already knew. Not the grief of a widow, not the indifference of a stranger, something older and more complicated than either, built from 26 years of marriage, a decade of quiet co-parenting, and feelings she had spent most of her adult life learning how to name. The tribute she posted to Instagram that week stopped people cold, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest in a way that celebrity statements almost never are. Those words opened a door into the real story behind one of Hollywood's most famous couples, a story about rock music and television stardom on the surface, and about addiction, loneliness, and the slow collapse of love underneath all of it. Valerie Ann Bertinelli stepped into American living rooms at 15 years old when she was cast as Barbara Cooper on One Day at a Time, and what followed was the kind of career trajectory that young actors spend entire lives hoping for. 2 Golden Globe wins before her 20th birthday, consistent television presence during a period when that kind of visibility meant something permanent in the public consciousness. She carried warmth through the screen that audiences genuinely trusted, which is rarer than it sounds and harder to manufacture than any publicist will admit. She wasn't performing likability. It came through naturally, and millions of viewers responded to it by making her feel like someone they already knew. Celebrity culture in the late 70s had a specific texture to it, and Valerie sat comfortably at the center of the wholesome, relatable end of that spectrum. Eddie Van Halen occupied a completely different corner of that same entertainment world. By 1980, guitar playing had been permanently altered by what he was doing with Van Halen, the band he co-founded and led as its lead guitarist. And albums like Van Halen and 1984 weren't simply successful records. They reset the expectations audiences brought to rock music entirely. His playing style had no real precedent. The speed, the technique, the raw physical energy of it all pointed towards something that felt almost accidental in its brilliance, like a person who had discovered abilities that the instrument hadn't known it was capable of. Rock stardom suited him completely, and he wore its chaos without apology. Late nights, relentless touring, recording sessions that stretched into mornings, and the kind of lifestyle that fame enables when nobody tells you to slow down. That was Eddie's world, and he moved through it at full speed. Valerie arranged the introduction herself in 1980, curious about the energy she'd observed from a distance and wanting to see what it looked like up close. What happened when they actually met moved faster than either of them seemed prepared for, and by April 1981 they were married, just months after first crossing paths. The press seized on it immediately because the contrast was irresistible. Television's girl next door and rock's most electrifying figure, choosing each other out of everyone else available. Fans from both worlds paid attention. The narrative wrote itself almost automatically, and the couple stepped into it without fully understanding how much weight that public image would eventually carry. The early years held real excitement between them, but excitement and compatibility aren't the same thing, and the differences in their daily lives started creating friction almost immediately. Valerie's schedule demanded consistency. Long shooting days, professional commitments, the structured rhythm of a television production. Eddie's calendar operated on entirely different logic, where tours ran for months. Recording had no predictable endpoint, and the rock world's relationship with time bore no resemblance to anything structured. She flew overnight regularly just to spend a few hours with him before turning around and heading back to set. And that kind of exhaustion accumulates in ways that don't always show up until much later. Two people can love each other genuinely and still find that their lives don't actually fit together, and that was the quiet problem building beneath the surface of a marriage the public found so compelling. None of that friction compared to what Eddie's substance use eventually became. What might have registered early on as the expected behavior of someone living inside rock culture revealed itself over time as something far more consuming. Addiction to alcohol and drugs that reshaped his behavior, altered his moods, and slowly eroded his availability as a husband. Valerie watched him cycle through sobriety and relapse across years, and each time hope returned with his recovery, it collapsed again when the relapse came. She stayed through it, helping him through treatment attempts and medical appointments and the mounting bills that came with managing a health crisis that addiction was actively worsening. When oral cancer cost Eddie a third of his tongue, the physical damage of his choices became impossible to ignore. He kept smoking anyway. He kept drinking. Valerie stood next to all of it, unable to change any of it, carrying the emotional weight of a marriage where one person was fighting addiction and the other was fighting to survive the aftermath of that fight. Loneliness inside a marriage operates differently than ordinary loneliness, and Valerie has described the specific quality of sitting in the same room as someone you love and feeling completely unreachable to them. That disconnection, not from lack of feeling, but from addiction occupying the space where closeness should have lived, defined long stretches of their 26 years together. She admitted years later to an affair during one of the marriage's lowest periods, and her explanation of it wasn't evasive. She had been starved of emotional connection long enough that she reached for it wherever she could find it. That admission didn't simplify the story, but it made the story true in a way that a cleaner version wouldn't have been. Her own body became a record of what she was carrying emotionally. Food became a way of managing feelings that had no other outlet, and the weight she gained during those years turned into public commentary of the cruelest variety, with tabloids treating her body as a subject available for dissection, while she was privately working through something that had nothing to do with appearance. She pulled back from public life during that period, avoided press opportunities, and built a quieter existence away from the spotlight that had accompanied her since adolescence. Mental health wasn't the public conversation then that it would eventually become, and women in particular were expected to absorb private suffering without naming it. Valerie absorbed it, and the cost of that absorption was visible even when the source wasn't. The separation became real in 2001, though the divorce wasn't finalized until December 2007, and across those 6 years Valerie said almost nothing publicly about what had happened. No interviews, no dramatic statements. She focused entirely on Wolfgang, their son, and structured her decisions around protecting him from whatever turbulence still surrounded the family. The media filled the silence with speculation, constructing narratives from whatever fragments they could find, but she let them. She wasn't ready to give them something more accurate, because accuracy requires honesty, and honesty requires processing, and she hadn't finished processing yet. That changed in 2008 when Losing It was published, and what Valerie put into that memoir represented something genuinely different from the careful public image she had maintained for years. She described Eddie's addiction with clarity and without turning him into a villain. He came across as a deeply flawed man fighting something neither of them had the language or the tools to address properly. She wrote about the loneliness she had felt inside the marriage, about the affair, and about the therapy that had helped her start making sense of everything she'd been carrying. Recovery and sobriety became part of her own story in that book, not Eddie's alone. Mental health, self-awareness, and the work of actually healing rather than simply enduring. Those themes ran through the memoir in ways that readers recognized and responded to with a level of gratitude she hadn't fully anticipated. Enough already arrived in 2022 and went further into territory the first memoir had only suggested. Valerie examined how much of her suffering had been sustained by her own idealization of Eddie and of what their marriage represented, holding on to a constructed version of their relationship that protected her from confronting certain truths. They had married too young, she reflected, without the emotional tools or the support systems that might have given them a different outcome. Fame arrived before either of them had developed the self-knowledge to handle it, and addiction compounded every gap that already existed. Loving someone deeply isn't the same as being built to withstand what their life will ask of you. That distinction took her years to fully absorb. The most direct statement came in 2024, when she said publicly that Eddie had not been her partner, and that they had been emotionally divorced for nearly 2 decades before the legal paperwork reflected that reality. Love, she explained, had shifted across those years until what remained no longer resembled what had originally existed between them. Some people were unsettled by the bluntness of it. Others recognized the honesty immediately, because that kind of slow emotional separation is something many people have lived through without ever having words for it. What she described wasn't bitterness. It was accuracy about the distance that had grown between who they were to each other at the beginning and who they had become by the end. Co-parenting kept Valerie and Eddie connected in a different way after the divorce, and that connection carried genuine warmth rather than obligation alone. Wolfgang became the reason they showed up at the same birthday parties and concerts and family milestones, not performing togetherness for anyone watching, but actually prioritizing their son above whatever unresolved feelings still existed between them. When Eddie's health deteriorated in his final years, she was present at his bedside alongside Wolfgang, and when he died in October 2020, her tribute to him held the full complexity of what he had meant across a lifetime. Not the husband the marriage had failed to sustain, but someone whose life had been woven into hers in ways that couldn't simply be unraveled. The tribute landed the way it did because people could feel that she wasn't performing grief or performing forgiveness. She was just telling the truth about something that had been real and complicated, and hers. A second marriage to financial planner Tom Vitale began in 2011, and Valerie carried into it the genuine belief that she had learned enough from the first one to do better. For a while it seemed like she had, but by 2021 she was filing for separation, and the divorce was completed in 2022. And what she said about it afterward was more self-aware than most public figures manage after a second marriage ends. She had stayed too long, she acknowledged, because she had always believed love alone could hold a relationship together. The second time around taught her what the first had started to, that love is not the same as compatibility, and that recognizing when something isn't working requires a kind of honesty that hope tends to delay. Therapy moved from occasional to non-negotiable during this period, and sobriety became a commitment she made to herself rather than to any external expectation. She started speaking openly about anxiety and panic attacks, and in November 2024 posted a video of herself in the middle of a severe anxiety episode, choosing visibility over privacy because she wanted people dealing with the same thing to know it wasn't something they were alone in experiencing. Mental health advocacy isn't typically where television stars from her generation end up, but Valerie arrived there through the specific education of having needed that kind of support and not always found it. A brief relationship with writer Mike Goodnow in 2024 unfolded publicly before ending later that same year, and both handled it with a maturity that reflected where she had arrived in her understanding of what relationships can be and what they don't always need to become. What Valerie Bertinelli has built from the long aftermath of a marriage the world thought it understood is not a triumphant second act in the Hollywood sense. It's something quieter and more durable. She carries self-knowledge now that she didn't have at 20, and the willingness to speak honestly about her own failures alongside Eddie's has made her something more useful than a celebrity, a person who demonstrates that it is possible to survive a life that looked perfect from the outside while falling apart on the inside, and to come out of that survival with enough clarity to say so plainly. The story of Valerie and Eddie Van Halen was never the love story that the public wanted it to be. What it actually was turned out to be more honest, more human, and in the end, more worth understanding than the fairy tale version anyone was originally sold.